Hi. Hello. Greetings also, if I may say. Yeah, I am going to talk about, what I read in 2023. Is it a bit late? Maybe, but, when you think about linear time, it sort of happened at the exact same time as everyone else who put out their 2023 reads. That's my theory or excuse or whatever. So yeah, I'm just going to talk about the books that I read in 2023. I read 31 of them. I'm going to give you some off-the-cuff thoughts on how I feel about them. A lot of them are books that I did for this channel, so I will either rehash a bit of my opinion, but also I'm going to talk about if my opinions changed at all, or if I felt I missed mentioning something. It'll come up. A lot of it's going to be reflections, I think, where I'm going to look at a book and be like, man, that was a bad book. But, it might be interesting, and it's kind of fun to do. The first reason I ever got started on book reviews was, I have an extremely poor memory, and I was finding that I was reading books, and then I would kind of forget everything that happened in them. And this would happen a lot in, series, too, where it would be I've read book 1, and then by the time I start book 2, I've forgotten a lot of really key details. And I found that writing book reviews and archiving them, it both gave me the sense of accomplishment, I have finished this book, but now I have truly finished it because I've taken time to process it and write a review. And it also would help me remember more because I would be taking a lot more attention to things, writing them down. And then if I was reading the second book in a series, I would reread the review I did of the first book to remember what was important. And I think that over time, obviously a lot of things have changed about my style and how I do things, but that's why I originally started. That's why I started on Goodreads, and I just enjoy collating that sort of data of this is what I read, this is why. Anyways, so first thing that I started this year with was Save the Pearls. Save the Pearls, technically I kind of read the first book over Christmas. I remember it being Christmas 2022 when I was reading Save the Pearls. And then the second book I did just at the very start of the year. So it's marked as my first ever book of the year for 2023 to really, mark what the year is going to be like. And in many ways it kind of did. Save the Pearls is bad, but it is legendary in a lot of ways. It's one of those just so extremely bad but infamous books. I'm glad I read it. As much as I really like reading super obscure things no one's ever heard of, I think those are just genuinely really fun. Reading something like this that's really popular for being bad, it still can be worth it because there's a reason it's so well known for being bad, Unlike a lot of things where maybe even, no, it's not really with bad movies, but sometimes, you engage with something that people call really bad and you're it wasn't really that interesting about it. There wasn't much to discuss about it. It just was bad. And I think that some books, I kind of feel like Empress Teresa for me would be that style of just, this is bad. The author clearly was just mentally unwell. I don't know about this. It doesn't really interest me that much. Whereas something that's written really genuinely, but turns out like Save the Pearls, is a lot more interesting to me. And then, of course, the most interesting is the obscure stuff no one's ever heard of. But no, God. Save the Pearls. Fun fact, only video on YouTube so far that I have that has been partially demonetized. Despite what people think, YouTube isn't as strict about monitoring content a lot of the time. It varies so much. Even me saying that is oh, that's a big umbrella statement. But there's a lot that you can get away with on YouTube that people have this sort of instinctual fear of the algorithm and YouTube censorship that they censor themselves more when it's you can say a lot of really dramatic terms. But yeah, Save the Pearls is the only one I've been demonetized partially for on a video. It might be the blackface. It might be the jungle cat sex scenes. We may never know. Second thing I read this year was the Command Ment, which was that anti-vax, well, it was more like a vaccine that could kill God. And I've been obsessed with that for so long, and then I just suddenly remembered it while talking in the Discord about bad book covers, and I was I discovered this book on NetGalley many years ago. I have to read it. And I'm still kind of obsessed with it. The Command Ment, for me, is one of the most peak bad books Everything about it is a failure and embarrassing, but also really intriguing, because it's like you get such insight into the worldview and the point of view of the author and the community around it, which is sort of where I've wound up getting into a lot of Christian books. But again, that's not anything particular about Christianity. It's just that there's a lot more Christian books that are published overall that have these really wacky premises. Like, what if they invented a vaccine that killed God? No, I love the Command Ment. It's bad. And when I was reading it, maybe I didn't love it. It was stressful to get through, I guess. But now in hindsight, I'm just like, the Command Ment, I gotta get back there. Gotta get back to that Command Ment. Then I read Finale. Finale was the last Hush Hush book. And Hush Hush has been my enemy of the YA section for so many years. I would say probably a full decade now, because I hated it when I was in high school. And that's when it was, first really popular. I think I read Hush Hush, the first book, 3 or 4 years ago. It took me a number of years to finally get up the nerve to read Finale. I read the third book, the year before. I had to space these out as much as possible. Finale was also the longest book I read this year, which I think is incredible, because I read 1 or 2 longer books, but Finale is 466 pages, and boy, does it feel like more. Hush Hush is... I struggle, with a lot of times when it comes to people who like a book that I don't like, it's fine to just be like, but okay, you do you. And sometimes it's with these YA books, I do think they're actively, harmful or really bad. I think Sarah J. Maas, for example. But most of the time it's I'm not going to convince you by coming out here and just being I fucking hate those books. But Finale, Hush Hush, I struggle to understand how people still defend Hush Hush. Obviously a lot of people who kind of like it now mostly have teenage nostalgia because they were just into it as a teen. But there are still people who kind of just hold out and support it, and apparently it had a heyday on TikTok recently, and it's atrociously written. The books are the same plot 3 times in a row, the writing is horrendous, and it's some of the most overly long books. Anyways, will we get to a book that I like? Well, next up, it's Max Ride. So Maximum Ride, that was sort of my big project this year, where I read all of Max Ride, the original series. And I was a huge Max Ride kid. I think I said a lot of this in the video, but I loved Maximum Ride. It was not the first, but one of the only things I've ever written fan fiction for. I don't read fan fiction. I don't really write it. But when I was 12 or 13 on Fiction Press, yes, I was on Fiction Press because I scrubbed off the names. I pretend it wasn't Max Ride. So yeah, I uploaded Max Ride fanfic on Fiction Press rather than fanfic.net, because I was just so into everything about it. And rereading it, I loved Max Ride. I love the original trilogy. They don't hold up that well as books, but they're just so fun and light and easy, and you can really dream of potential. It's just that as the series goes on, so this is covering in many ways School's Out Forever, book 2, and then up to Saving the World and Other Extreme Sports. The original trilogy of Max Ride, I stand by it, honestly. It's fun. It's nice. I'm having that nostalgia cloud me a little bit, but I think Max Ride has some merit. The rest of the series doesn't, though. Dear God. The amount of comments I've had, and I do read the comments, I definitely miss comments, and I don't respond to every single comment like I used to because there's too many of them, is most of the reason. But I try to respond to things like questions and, clarification sometimes. Max Ride is the one where I've had almost the most comments on, and so many of them are people who say the exact same thing, and that's the final warning is where everything went wrong, and everybody had that, the first book I ever realized that books could be bad was the final warning. And I think that was my experience too. And it's incredible how formulative it was for so many kids to learn what disappointment felt like when they read the rest of Mac's Ride. And then, yeah, we have Max. I don't remember what happens in Max. Oh no, that's the Krelp, isn't it? Or is that Angel? No, Angel's the cult one. The Krelp one is Max. Fang... Dylan? They sort of blend together even now. And then, obviously, we go on to Nevermore and Maximum Ride Forever. But, Max Ride. Anyways, another thing I read this year, here's something I didn't talk about. I read the Severance Lexington letter. It's such a small thing. This thing barely counts as a book. But I do want to also just say I love Severance. Severance, if you haven't seen it, great TV show, totally see it. I think it's on like Apple, whatever the heck, but you know, you can find it elsewhere. And it has like one little ebook document side information, and I got extremely into the lore of Severance, and I'm so excited for the rest. And this is just me plugging Severance, honestly. I'm obsessed with everything about Severance. I love it. It's just so beautifully done. And yeah, there's something called the Lexington letters. You know, it's barely a book, but if you don't know about it and you're a Severance fan, look it up because it exists. Now, the next series of reads is stuff that was in my book review over the summer thing. I wound up going on vacation over the summer. I don't normally do that, but my flatmate's family took me out on a nice vacation. And while I was there, I had a lot of free time to read books by the pool, like a real fancy person. And that's when I tried to specifically read a bunch of stuff that I'd been holding on to, but I just get distracted by doing things for this channel. This is why most of the books I read this year were things for this channel. But yeah, I read a couple of things while I was there, and that's Utterly Dark, Heart of the Wild. Utterly Dark is such a fantastic, imaginative, anything Philip Reeve does, I love it. I own all of his books pretty much, and I love them so much. And I know this isn't very helpful, but this is one of those things where there's a reason maybe that I do mostly critiquing of books, because when it comes to a book I love, I really struggle with explaining how much I love it. I'm just like, it's great. And I'm not very good at the backing arguments of it. Whereas when I go, it's bad, I feel like I'm pretty good at giving some reasons why. But Utterly Dark, Philip Reeve. If you haven't read Mortal Engines or Railhead or Utterly Dark or, you know, anything by him, please do. The next one that I read there was Reaper Man by Terry Pratchett. Reaper Man was my first exposure into Discworld. I have all of Discworld over here, but they're not mine. They're my flatmates. I have a lot of people comment on them and say that I have good taste. I would say I have good taste now because I do enjoy Discworld, but I only just started reading any books in the series really recently. When I was a teenager, I heard of Discworld. I sought out Discworld, but it wasn't in any of the bookshops in my very small Vermont town, and I didn't really know about or could do online shopping at that point. So Discworld was just unobtainable to me, but I'd heard a lot about it from Tumblr. And finally reading it, though, it was incredible. Like, I instantly picked up Reaper Man, and I was like, oh, this clicks with me 100%. This is funny, this is heartfelt, this is poignant, this is weird, this is just sort of everything that I really, really like. And I just had such a blast with it. Reaper Man is not one of those advised starting points, but Discworld's really open, honestly, and you can kind of start with most any Discworld book, if I'm honest. But I honestly think Reaper Man's a pretty good shout. It's not the first book that centers on death as a character. It's actually the second. The first one is Mort. And in many ways, probably reading Mort first makes sense. But Reaper Man is this wonderful story of death being forced to retire, and there isn't really a backup death properly. So there becomes an excess of life. And it travels between, like, death trying to retire to be a farmer and having like an existential crisis about death, even though he is death, and also a bunch of like silly wizards having to deal with a malevolent shopping mall. Top tier. Gideon the Ninth Gideon the Ninth is, I just put together a poll on, like, what should I read next by community popular vote. And Gideon the Ninth and Harrow the Ninth was really highly suggested, even though I did read it over the summer, but I never did a proper full review on it. Gideon the Ninth, I don't know. On reflection, I think I like it a lot more than my first impressions gave off. When I did my review of it as part of that vlog thingy or whatever, I think that a lot of people were like, yes, I also didn't like Gideon the Ninth. And it's more complicated than that. I like Gideon the Ninth. I just really don't think that it's, say, like, the best thing ever. And I also think that Gideon the Ninth, the first book, is... there's just a lot of things about it that I really actually dislike. About the structure and the plot and the pacing and a lot of just, like, narrative decisions that I don't agree with. But beyond that, you can really tell that there's so much, like, effort and thought put into pretty much everything going around. You can really tell that it's something that the author has worked very hard on and has a very good understanding of and is really passionate about. And also, a lot of the ideas in it just, like, they slap. They're really cool. I think part of the reason it's become so beloved on Tumblr, for example, as well as just the internet in general, is that it aesthetically, it slaps. I think a lot of the actual narrative writing and plot has a lot of problems to it. But things like the characters, who are very clear, easy, iconic kind of archetypes, and also, like, interesting designs, so it really calls to fan artists. The aesthetic of it, I think all of that is part of the reason it's become so successful, and I don't really disagree on that. I just think that there's also a lot of flaws. But overall, I liked it. I dressed up as Harrow for Halloween, even though I haven't finished reading Harrow the Ninth. I'm 20% in, and I have been since summer. No, Gideon, we'll see. I think I'll eventually get through the rest of it. It's extremely Homestuck. I'm sure somebody's done this before, but if you're not familiar with Homestuck, it's incredible how many characters are very, like, direct descendants of the Homestuck characters. I wouldn't call it like, oh, it's plagiarism. The author's clearly just taking these things, but the inspiration is extremely obvious if you were a hardcore Homestuck like me. So, like, there are these two sisters who are archetypically, I would say, well, one of them is Vriska. Anytime that you see, I think her name is Yanth? I think it's Yanth. Anytime you see Yanth, you can just put, like, brackets that says Vriska after it, and you're set. There's a guy named Nibirius it's Iridan. It's Iridan. He even has a trident. It's one of those things where, like, I assume that a lot of the fandom knows these sorts of things, but the parallels are so obvious. A lot of people also say Gideon herself is extremely Dave Strider. From the shades, to the sword, to the joking attitude. And then a lot of people try to put Harrow as sort of a Rose-like character, and that's another thing where I didn't think about Rose at the time, and then I was like, she is a lot like Rose from Homestuck. And then I also would kind of wonder if Yanth and her sister are like the Scourge sisters, but I think that's at a point where I'm, like, leaving the realms of good speculation that makes sense. Anyways, next up is Extreme Makeover. I loved this book. This is one of my top reads of the year for sure. Honestly, it might be my top read of the year. I have to go and revisit this list before I tell you that for certain, because off the top of my head, don't remember. But Extreme Makeover was this apocalypse fueled by DNA copying lotion. It was just mostly about what if one idea happened and that changed the world just forever. And I adore it so much. It's such a fun read, an interesting read. It makes you think about things, and it's really cool. I loved it. Next up, Angels Before Man. Angels Before Man. It's an angel book. It's about the fall of Lucifer. It's wet. This is how I described it. I described it as just, it's wet. It's wet, though, this book. That's the main way I describe it. On reflection, what are my feelings about this book? It's difficult to tell. I like a lot of it. I like the ambition of it. I like the ideas of it. I believe in and trust the author. I guess maybe I just didn't vibe with it, but it's one of those things where I feel like even though I ultimately don't vibe with Angels Before Man, I don't think that that's anything to do with like the literary merit of it. I think it's just not quite the kind of writing style that I click with, and I didn't like the second half of the book very much. Kind of at all, even though I loved the first half. So it's a complicated one. I don't know if I'll read the sequel or not, because I know there's a sequel. But I like what they're doing. I like what they did, I guess. We need more interesting Angel books like it. But I don't know. In the end, I'm not sure that it really worked with me. Then I read If I Disappear. I like picking up thrillers sometimes. I really do. Thrillers are very light, easy, and usually utterly disappointing at the end. And If I Disappear was such a huge letdown, I fully spoiled it at the end of my reading review video for the summer. But that's because I just would be like, please don't read this book. It's not going to make you happy. It's just... Thrillers draw you in. They make you think, ooh, a mystery. And then you learn that it's not a mystery so much as a Wattpad approach of end every chapter on a cliffhanger or something, and then when you get to the climax, just slap something together. You know? Okay, the next one is, I think, the big one to discuss about all of this, and that's Tender as the Flesh. It's Tender as the Flesh, which is a book that is the most controversial review I've ever written. It's an interesting one. I still don't like Tender as the Flesh, guys. I don't. And I don't agree with a lot of the analysis people put forward. But also, when it comes to Tender as the Flesh, I am aware that it is meant to be, in many ways, social political commentary. I was aware of that reading it, and it's clear when you're reading the book. However, it's kind of... It doesn't do it well, guys. It just doesn't do it very well. The book isn't very good. I constantly wound up... I mostly have avoided the comment section for it, because as I said, I was like, please, I don't want to argue things, especially like arguing meat-eating ethics and things. But... I think a lot of people, like, I wish that I read the book that people tell me that it was. I wish that I'd read this incredible, like, commentary on capitalism turning us all into beasts, and that book sounds great. I don't think that was Tender as the Flesh. I think Tender as the Flesh wants to be a mix of social political commentary, which is very much there, but it's also doing that through the lens of the meat industry, and along the way, it gets very distracted by the meat industry. That's sort of where I've landed on this. I don't think that I've had some, rude comments about things, and it's really not me being willfully a jerk about it. I think that I just don't think it's that good of a book. And if you really like it, that's all right with me. Like, I can't stop you on these things. I can just go like, yeah, here's my thoughts on it. This is my takeaway. Whatever you took away, I'm glad if it made you think, if you really enjoyed it, if you were, shocked, but not at, just the over-the-top obligatory gore. But, no. I don't like Tender as the Flesh. Next up, I read Unwelcome Bodies. Unwelcome Bodies was a very random short story collection. I don't think anyone's really heard of it. It hasn't really got many reviews, I think, on Goodreads. It's just one of those very strange things that I found randomly one day and was like, okay, let's see. And I really like doing that. Like, as always, there's a lot of ethics around reviewing indie books. I really wish I could think of a good, maybe I'll write an essay about it, but it'll be a lot of work. You need to review books, by the way. You do. Because people don't review books very often, and so that really can skew... With an indie book, one review that you make has so much more weight than if you're reading a book that has 200,000 reviews. If you read an indie book, you should review it, even if you don't normally write reviews. It doesn't have to be a long, in-depth review like I do. It can just be like, I liked this book, or even, I didn't like this book. But I think that we need to be aware of, especially like reviewing and reading, the difference between indie and mainstream books. Because the other thing about reviewing an indie book, and one of the reasons that I do honestly add a bit of weight and a little more forgiveness with indie books, I often will bump them up a star rating if I'm like at 0.5, I will round up with indie books where I might round down with other books. And that's because, like, an indie book doesn't really have any promotion behind it. It doesn't really have any sales necessarily. And if it has 0 ratings, no one's gonna buy it. If it has only 1 rating, because I'm the only person who reviewed it, which has happened multiple times, I suddenly am the only voice of opinion on this book. And while I like to believe that I'm an okay voice of opinion on a book and I judge things fairly, it's also true that that is a huge weight on the author. If the author has this book out that they've had, and there's only 1 review, and it's a 1-star review, and it's by me, I have had a huge impact on their self-esteem, probably, on their work, on the likelihood they'll ever sell a copy. And that's just sort of why you need a lot of people to review books, because opinions vary. And even when it comes to a book I don't really like I didn't like Unwelcome Bodies that much overall, it's still true that it feels very rude, especially as an indie author myself, to ignore the fact that my ratings have much more impact. And I've sort of gone on a side rant here, but basically, like, please review books, especially books that you like. If you didn't like a book and you don't want to leave a review about it because you feel mean or what, that's fine. I'm sure the author would appreciate that. But no matter your feelings, it's good to have a review, or even just a star rating. Because I remember, and this is still roughly the case, I think about 1%, less than 1% of all my book sales have ever had like a review. And that's going to be pretty much equivalent for a lot of people. I don't think I'm that unique for having a low percentage of that. Anyways, Hummingbird Killer. This is the sequel to The Butterfly Assassin, which I promoted a couple times because I like to talk about how good The Butterfly Assassin is. Hummingbird Killer stepped it up. It was great. I'm excited for the next book. As I often say, I do know the author, but like they're super cool, so, you know, I'm not actually being biased there that much. Well, you know, maybe. I wouldn't have probably bought it or read it if it wasn't my friend's book, but I am very genuine about it because I've definitely read friends' books and did not like them and wrote them negative reviews. Because I don't know if this is an autism thing, I'm very uncomfortable with like lying about my opinion. Next thing I read this year, Small Gods. This is another Discworld book. Unlike Reaper Man, Small Gods was not like an instant click for me. Small Gods is a lot more, I think, it's serious, but in that comic way that Pratchett does. He's saying a lot more in it. He's making much more of like a point about religion and gods and things like that, and belief. And I really enjoyed all of the things he had to say about it. But it's definitely a different kind of Discworld book, which is one of the great things about Discworld. And so, not my favorite one, but like, again, when I've read Pratchett, every time I've been like, oh, this is great. This is great. See, this is what I'm talking about, where I'm not the best at writing these sort of really positive, glowing reviews. I wouldn't highly suggest me for a book blurb kind of person. So, next up is The Blessed. The Blessed was honestly one of my most exciting reads. When I discovered The Blessed, I knew instantly this was going to be a video, and it was going to be an exciting video. I didn't need to know anything about what was inside the books to instantly just be like, oh, okay. And if you've seen my video on it, yeah, The Blessed is all of that. There's a lot of interesting discussion in the comments around that sort of thing. And it's one of those things where I've definitely had a lot of religious people be like, there's no way she's Catholic. And no, the author's like super Catholic. It's just, is it a good portrayal of Catholicism? No, definitely not. But was the author Catholic and believing she was doing a good portrayal of her religion, presumably? Yeah. And that's sort of the unbelievable thing when it comes to books like this. And I mean, content in general. You can wind up with something that you have something severely in common with somebody, and then they put out a work like The Blessed, and you're like, I wish that we weren't connected in any way. I think that's the case with The Blessed, where a lot of people were just shocked at it. And it's just shocking. I have not succumbed to any temptation to try and learn more about its history, but other people have talked about it, and it's like, she was at Comic-Con promoting it once. She was on like a panel, and she talked about how growing up saints were like superheroes to her, and that's what she was trying to emulate in The Blessed. She didn't. The Blessed's also one of those incredible ones where a lot of people struggle to believe that it's real and sincere, which I get a lot on my bad books that I read, and when I discuss them, or mostly just in YouTube comments, people believe that it has to be satire, or that it's, and this is so common, fetish content, or, like, numbers scrubbed off fetish content. And it's never either of those guys. Like, I don't really know how to tell you about this, but that's not what, if it was written for a fetish, I would be able to tell. I've been on the internet. The truth is that a lot of people just write badly, and they don't necessarily know that, and then due to things like popular crazes at the time, or connections very often, that book just gets passed forward, and nobody stops it. And it's not a joke, they just don't know. After that, I read Uglies. As we speak right now, my Uglies video is still not out, but it will be. Rereading Uglies, because I read this as a teen, was a really interesting experience. It was one of the first times I've picked up a book, and maybe this helps show my attitude towards it. When I pick up these books, I don't go in expecting they will definitely be bad. Like, when I read something like The Blessed, I know instantly, oh, this will be bad. But there's always that potential that it will surprise you. I've definitely read plenty of things, and I've been surprised, and I can be pleasantly surprised. There's often stuff also in bad books that I wind up liking. Uglies was one of those ones where I was revisiting it, and I was thinking about it quite a lot, and I was thinking especially about self-harm in it and the betrayal of that, because that's a very big thing. And I kind of expected it would really suck to revisit it, and then when I reread it, actually, I really liked Uglies. And yeah, I actually found myself not sure of what to say about it. I read the first book and I thought to myself, God, I haven't taken any notes on anything. I haven't highlighted anything with like sticky tabs. I just sort of read it and was like, yeah, I remember this, I like it. And that isn't very common, but it just happens. Like sometimes I read a book and yeah, there it is, that's the book. So yeah, Uglies. As I read the trilogy, there was more to discuss, especially the mentioned, like, self-harm sort of things, and some things about, like, how it's aged in general. But overall, yeah, Uglies is actually pretty alright. It's one of those things where the first book, at least, is, I feel like, one of the few books of its type and era where it's like, oh no, that does hold up. Because obviously I specialize in books from about this time and era, and, not exactly this, but this genre. And it's so rare that you pick one up and be like, yeah, no, that holds up. Uglies is actually like that. The next thing I read, oh gosh, was 0.4 or 0.4. 0.4, no one's ever seen or heard of this, but I happened to stumble upon it in a secondhand bookshop, which is where I get the majority of my things. And 0.4, not a very good name. Not a very known book, I would say. I super loved it. It's not like an advanced reading sort of, there's not a lot of depth to it. It's I would say, middle grade to early YA book. And it's also the kind of book, and this sounds really rude, but it's a book aimed for boys. And it's one of those things where it's like any book is aimed at men. Men can read anything they want, and they do. But when it comes to the YA market, there's a very clear preference for books aimed towards women, and books that are aimed towards men, or boys, I guess, because we're talking about YA, are usually written a lot simpler. They're usually more focused on the action and some jokes and moving forward, and then they follow like a cool plot of some kind. I own multiple books that are exactly like this. And that's fine, but it's slightly different from what a YA at the exact same age group would handle it. Even if you had a YA book that was exactly the same premise as like Point 4, but it was instead meant to be sold more to girls, so many other things would be different about it, where Point 4 is very decisively like 15-year-old boys. And because of that, the writing's quite simple and the plot moves along very quickly. The text is a bit larger, actually. It's because there's this association, and I think it still is true, that young boys read a lot less than young girls. So when you make a book for young boys, it is usually written at sort of a lower reading level, because it's trying to encourage people like, let's read something fast, quick, that's what boys want. I don't know. This is something that I've observed and is kind of true. And yeah, Point 4 though. I really liked it. It's one of those things where I can't recommend it because it's not like literary high art, but it's just a very fun, fast read. If you ever stumble upon it, I would say like, yeah, read it. You can read in like a setting, like one sitting. It's about a boy who finds that he and 4 other people are immune to something very weird that has happened to humanity. All of humanity stood still, and then all of humanity started acting weird. And the mystery is just what has happened, what's going on. And the end reveal was super cool. I really liked how this book ended. I liked the reveal, because obviously that's a basic, like a Doctor Who premise. The mystery, as always, is it going to be resolved in a satisfying way? And Point 4 actually does it, and I liked it a lot. Next up. I read The Barbie Murders. The Barbie Murders is a pulp book that I've had for a while. The cover looks great. The title is great. Never read The Barbie Murders. The Barbie Murders by John Varley. I don't read anything by him. If I really had to, don't read anything by him. I can definitely say that because I think these themes will come back. It's a short story collection. It's a bunch of sci-fi stuff. The first couple ones are pretty good. They're engaging. There's a lot of interesting world building and ideas going on. And then the last like 4 or 5? The last several stories of the collection all share a theme. And that theme is, well, it's pedophilia. But it's pretending it isn't. It's a really weird thing. I don't really want to go into it more because obviously it can be a very like triggering subject and just upsetting in general. But yeah, don't pick up these books. It's incredible that these were published for what the content in them is like. I have a review for it on my blog if you want to know what I'm talking about and some of the details. I don't go into too much detail because even then, this was a book where like by the end and this is very rare, I felt kind of disturbed by what I read. I was just uncomfortable. That's one of the cases where having to write a review about it was basically me processing what I just read. Because, dear God. Anyways, the next book I read was Nightbane. Yeah, so full circle, we've come back to Nightbane. And Nightbane is still in my house. In fact, it's right in front of me right now. Oh my God. And I don't like it. And I don't know what to do about it. I just have this copy. I don't want this copy. I don't want to release it into the wild, I guess. Maybe I just should. But I feel like if I do, I need like a note that I put in the margins that's like, please only read this for literary purposes. If you're a young, impressionable teen, please, you gotta put it down. But no, Nightbane. That's what I ended my year with. I guess in about November. I read a couple books this year already. They're sitting nearby me. I'm trying to get back into it, and I am also trying to read some better books as well. When we're talking about my year in review, I mean, this has mostly been books for this channel, and especially really bad books. And I genuinely love reading bad books. I find it a joy even when it hurts. you guys who keep begging me to please read good books for my own sake, I don't necessarily believe you, and I've been ignoring those suggestions for many years now from many concerned people. But yeah, I probably should read a couple more good books. Have I read any good ones yet? No. But eventually I will, and I have some plans of what I'm doing. Anyways, that's my 2023 year in review reading. I don't think I have much else to say. Again, I am working, but my life can be a bit of a mess. I have a lot of problems. A normal thing to say. And it takes me a while to get stuff. But I really appreciate you guys hanging out. I appreciate the Discord server. It's cool that this has happened to me, that I have this YouTube sort of thing, that anyone would listen to me just read a bunch of things about books I read this year. It's really cool. It's something that should be studied in a lab, I would say, in terms of the social experience of it. But it's super cool, and I'm rambling so much right now. Anyways, I should finish rambling now and just say cheers. Yeah.